Eric Eisenbrey is the founder of the Eyes and Brains STEM Center, a microschool in the small town of Elkins, West Virginia, that opened last summer with a focus on science, technology, engineering, and math. Eric is a state certified teacher with both a bachelor's and master's degree in education, as well as an additional master's degree in curriculum and instruction. He was a public school teacher in West Virginia for 10 years in both elementary and middle schools before deciding to launch Eyes and Brains STEM Center, his exciting year-round K-12 microschool. Eric Eisenbrey, thank you for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Carrie.
Well, I'm glad to have you. I had a chance to meet you in person late last year at an education entrepreneurship workshop in Charleston. Of course, you are in Elkins, West Virginia, which is about 2 hours northeast of Charleston. So it was great to have you make the drive down to talk with other kind of new and aspiring education entrepreneurs. There's really, I think, a lot of momentum in the state now for some of these new and innovative education models, and you're very much on the forefront of that. So before we get into talking specifically about why you decided to launch Eyes and Brains STEM Center last year, maybe you could take us back and tell us a little bit more about why you decided to get into education to begin with, and what was your experience like as a classroom teacher in conventional public schools for about a decade?
All right. Yeah, I think my start into public education has been kind of like my journey into microschooling in some ways. It hasn't been exactly the straightest of paths. I got into a local university in Louisville, which is where I'm from, and I started in there thinking I was going to do something with tech, but the tech program had just gotten closed down. So then I thought I would go the business route. And I went really heavy into the business classes in my first year. And I just very quickly learned that was not the fit for me. I could not see myself saying, hey, I can do this. This comes easy to me. Now pay me this much for it. And so they had a pretty strong education program at the college. And I thought, at one point in my life as a younger kid, I thought maybe I wanted to be a teacher when I grew up. So I got involved in the education program, and it fit with my just drives to help people. That was like, this is what I want to do. I want to help people. This is how I can do it. I had some good teachers as a student that really I felt I'd connected with, and that as being kind of the more quiet, not obviously noticed kid a lot of times, that meant a lot to me, that I had some teachers that saw me and had that connection with me. So I wanted to be able to offer that to students.
Great. And so you took you did your education degrees then in Kentucky, and
Mm-hmm.
then made your way to West Virginia. So what was it like teaching in public schools in West Virginia for those 10 years?
It was a shift because of just, you could see that there was a difference of where the students were coming from. From the big city, there's obviously more money, though I did, see work in some of the lower poverty schools there, going through my education experience. But there's definitely a shift in how education was viewed, I think was probably the biggest thing for me. Because there was more, I felt more of a, let's just get through the day from the faculties, and from the schools. And that wasn't something I necessarily expected. So being a science teacher, that was my primary area, was as a science teacher. I had to basically kind of always create things on my own. I wasn't really handed a curriculum. At one point, I actually was, and by that point, I'd gotten so used to creating my own that I was like, why should I teach from this box? I've gotten so used to just kind of picking and choosing and finding what works. But even through all of that, I found that that the one thing I was always trying to find the newest thing. I was always trying to find what's the newest thing in education. What's the best practices? How can I best reach my students? And that was definitely a driving thing for me. And I wanted to try to encourage others to do that too. And I tried to find ways of I felt like I would read stuff that said we need to build up a stronger community in the schools. We need to get students invested in the school in order for them to be more invested in their education. But I would get, I'd get some support, but then I'd also get some pushback for that. And so I think there's this very slow kind of build of here I am like reading up on all the greatest stuff that's going on in education, but at the same time, trying to actually see that happen in the school isn't quite, it's not, it doesn't fall into place. They don't fit together. So there was that side of it. The other thing that really eventually ended up pushing me out of education in the public schools was that part of my drive to find the newest things was I wanted to reach my students. I was there for my students. And I would end every year feeling like I could have done a little more, could have done a little more. And it wasn't until I stepped away that I kind of realized maybe I couldn't have, maybe maybe the system prevented me from doing it. I always kind of had this self-blame of, if I could have put in a little bit more time here, a little bit more time there. But I was also that teacher that would get there at, 6 a.m. and then leave at 8 p.m. at night working on things, trying to perfect lesson plans or grading. And there's only so much that you can put into it. But when you're responsible for 120 or more students in a year, you're not going to connect with all of them the way you want to, and the way students need a connection.
You said maybe the system prevented it. I think that's such a profound statement, right? Because teachers are as caught up in the system that has its own kind of standardized model and curriculum expectations that they can't be creative in the ways that they want to be. And you experience that firsthand, where you're seeing all of these innovative ideas and educational best practices, and then the inability to implement that, at least to the fullest extent, within your classroom. It sounds like it was really frustrating. And so I think you're right that that it's the system that's the problem. It's certainly not the people in the system. And so you were teaching, among other school districts, you were teaching in the public schools in Elkins, this small town, a couple of hours away from Charleston, which you said was there were a lot of coal mining families there. I wonder, what were there other educational options for students in that area, or how did that fit into your decision-making process around deciding to create something new for that community?
There's not a whole lot of choices. There are a couple of private schools, smaller private schools, and then now there's kind of some online options thanks to COVID, but really there weren't a lot of choices for students or parents. And in the school system, everything about those kind of choices basically gets talked about negatively. There's a lot of this talk, if a parent is homeschooling their kid, well, then their kid's probably not getting any sort of education. Or there's the same kind of argument that the private schools are just collecting a paycheck. So there's definitely a lot of negativity towards school choice in the public schools, and I initially really bought into that. When I was a public teacher, I felt like I was a strong believer in public education. I mean, I believe in education is still extremely important, but at that time, I also felt like public education is the only choice. That's what everyone needs. We need to make sure that kids are getting that. And some of it was just my time away from it, and some of it was also I have a couple of kids of my own, and my daughter especially is starting to see. She's just now in 4th grade. So when I left teaching, she was just in 1st grade, but just in those first couple of years seeing her education, I started to I don't know, kind of get a bit of a wake up to the fact that, maybe this isn't really working.
So then what was your path to ultimately opening the microschool? What was sort of the timing from when you left the district to opening that program? What were the steps you took, and how did that all go?
So like I said, it wasn't exactly a straight path. I left the classroom thinking that I was going to go into becoming a curriculum coach, and I would go back into the schools and I would, take all the ideas and I'd work at trying to make the classrooms better by helping teachers. And so I started into a master's program at Western Governors University, got through it in under a year, but as I was going through it, reading up on all the techniques and everything, and reading up a lot more on educational philosophy than I had done before, it became more and more clear to me that what I wanted and what works in the classroom didn't match. They didn't fit together. And so I hit a point where I was like, okay, I don't want to go back into the classroom because I'm not actually going to be able to make these changes. I would just be frustrated and burnt out again in a few years. So then I took some entrepreneurial classes. I did some work as a handyman, trying to just keep ends meeting, and started homeschooling my daughter because of the first year after COVID, we did the homeschool online thing that the district offered. I wasn't a big fan of it. I wasn't a big fan of what I was seeing from her as far as her own thoughts on education at that point. And so I decided, the next year, things were still very much up in the air. We're still in the midst of, are they going to be in school? Are they not going to be in school? So I decided to homeschool. And as I started to really focus on her education, and then knew that my son was getting to the point he was going to be entering kindergarten, I started to work with him some. That's when I started to kind of think, okay, how, like, I want to be doing this, but how can I take this and do it for more than just my kids? And so I did like most people my age do these days. I started floating around YouTube and eventually saw in some comments of one video something about John Taylor Gatto's book. I picked that up and read it, was blown away by it, picked up another one of his books, and strangely enough, it was in the introduction of whichever version I had of it. I'm sure I've shared it with somebody by now, but it said something about, it mentioned John Holt, and then it mentioned microschools. And so then I started down that path, and it was actually researching microschools because, like, I found out pretty quick enough about it that I was like, hey, this seems like maybe this is the path. I started looking at all the options out there, and that was when I found Mara on and the microschool builders on YouTube. And I watched a couple of videos of her talking. I found her website because everything she was saying about, teachers still being in control of what they want, but also, creating something that's really for the students resonated with me. And so I finally scheduled a call with her and joined the microschool builders group, which is now evolving into a microschool builders district that I'm working with.
Oh, that's so great. And we had Mara Leineberger on the podcast recently talking about microschool builders. Of course, she was talking about and writing about microschools well before it became trendy over the past couple of years. Her book about microschool building came out in 2018. And of course, now she's become an even more sought after expert and guide for entrepreneurs like you who want to create these kinds of microschools. And so what happened next when you teamed up with Mara and microschool builders? What were sort of the steps that then you took to actually get to launch?
So I joined her class basically that she offers, and went through the process of building out my plan for what I wanted the school to be like. Realized that I wanted to continue building off of a school that built off my strengths, which, as I'd spent most of my time as a science teacher, I wanted something that had that focus. I also knew, though, from all my reading and everything, that I wanted to make sure that I'm creating a school that leans more in that democratic model, that leans more towards the Sodbury schools, that offers students that control over their education. Because one of the things that probably I found more frustrating than misbehaving students in school were those students that had so much potential, but only cared about getting whatever it was to get the A, and then that was it. So I wanted to really build a school that gave students some choice and some control and an ability to follow their passion. So it wasn't just making an adult happy.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned reading John Taylor Gatto's book. Of course, he wrote Weapons of Mass Instruction and Dumbing Us Down and the Underground History of American Education. He, like you, was a longtime public school teacher before, kind of calling out what he saw as some of sort of the harmful characteristics of conventional schooling. And yet you talk about wanting your kind of educational philosophy to be focused more around Sudbury schooling or self-directed learning. You mentioned John Holt as well. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about kind of how you came to that educational philosophy. I've talked before about that my children attend the original Sudbury school, Sudbury Valley School, and I wrote a book about unschooling that looks at that kind of philosophy of learning. And I'm just curious what your path was toward finding that approach.
Yeah, so a lot of it was just doing reading on it, and some of it even came back to the master's program when I was looking at educational philosophy. Um, I knew from my own experience, just thinking about my own education, it was so often that I was supplementing what I was being taught just by reading on my own, finding things I was passionate about. The things you're interested in are the things that you're going to learn and you're going to remember. And so being in the classroom and trying to force kids to memorize the phases of the moon every year, just in even in those moments, it was like, yeah, it's fun to know this, but how far is this going to take them? Does every kid really care about the phases of the moon? And then the other part of it was just was a lot of it came from is coming even more so. It just kind of continues to build is watching my own kids learn. My daughter loved making up stories and telling stories, but we couldn't get her to write. She hated writing. But so much of that was just because she was being told constantly, you have to write this kind of paper, this kind of way. It has to be this long. As she's had some time to unschool, she has really started to take off and found a love of writing, which we knew that she could have, and if she just had the freedom to enjoy it. And then my own son, as a kindergartner, I've been probably like way more hands off than I would have expected with his education, I would say. But the other day, he just haven't spent time teaching him how to write his numbers. But the other day, he had cut a piece of paper into strips and he decided he was going to write the numbers on it. And he went and numbered one to, well, he eventually went back the next day and finished. He ended up going to one to like 63 without any help. Just that was what he had decided to do. And that's what he did. And, he's 6. How many kids at 6 are writing 1 to 60 on their own because that's what they decided to do and doing so correctly, which is even more surprising.
I love that story. That's such a perfect example of what we mean by self-directed education and allowing children the freedom to follow their interests and passions in their own time and in their own ways. And so you had this educational philosophy nailed down. You knew what you wanted your microschool to look like. What was it like sort of in the mechanics of it in terms of finding a location and getting ready to launch? What was the kind of practical pieces of starting a small business, essentially? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so the big thing for me has been basically I was determined that I was going to open the school no matter what my situation was. So at first I was ready to open it out of my house if that's what it took. I knew that micro schools, thanks to some new legislation, which I followed through and made sure it got passed, that micro schools were now a defined thing and that I would be able to then operate as a micro school because of that, though there are still some legal roadblocks that need to be sorted out around that. But I knew that I could at least say I'm opening a micro school. And so I knew that at the very least I was going to open out of my house. But then I knew my next step was to really get my name out there. Uh, Having spent most of my time working in a nearby district, if I was opening my school there, I probably would have had some more recognition. It would have been a little bit easier. But having not spent as much time in the Elkins Middle School, I didn't have as much of a name here. So I knew I needed to build that up. So I started reaching out to groups I knew worked with kids, and just started saying, can we do something together? I reached out to the local playhouse, the Old Brick Playhouse, and I know that they run a program in the summer. They do something for the elementary kids where they teach them a little bit about doing a play, and then they have a play. During the school year, they work more with the middle school groups, and they spend a lot of time training them and rehearsing and having them do a play as well. And it's one of their bigger events of the year. So I reached out to them because I had also known that the other thing they'd done was they had set up a space during COVID for parents to have their kids come and work on their schoolwork. But I knew that that was something that they had discontinued after the schools went back into session. And so I started talking with them about my ideas. And what we initially did was we started having what we called adventure days. And that was once a month, and we've still been continuing these, but once a month, I would spend an hour doing some sort of science lesson with kids on a day that the public schools got out early. And then they'd spend an hour doing theater work with the kids. And we were working with elementary students for that. And so I did things on leaves and slime and DNA and just fun little science activities. But it was a way to get my name out there and to start to show that I'm an active participant in the community. And as we worked together, eventually it reached a point where they offered me some space that they had upstairs to go ahead and set up for the classroom. And so that's actually where I am now. Because the other side of it is I'd kind of as a secondary way of building up my name in the community was I went ahead and I, after having gotten a VILA grant, started up a robotics program. So I also have a robotics program that's for K to 8th graders.
Ah, I love that story. And I love that you really started by kind of building relationships with people in the community that were also kind of aligned with you in terms of providing enrichment opportunities for local youth. And then starting small by offering these kind of one-off programs to build up your reputation. And then that evolves into being offered space. I think that's great. And then you mentioned a VELA microgrant, the VELA Education Fund that provides microgrants to education entrepreneurs like you who are working on creating non-traditional educational models. So great to see that you were able to do that with your robotics program. Eric, you also mentioned the microschool legislation that you said you were a big advocate for. West Virginia was a pioneer in passing microschool legislation last year that really designates microschools as a separate educational entity, separate from homeschooling, public schooling, and private schooling. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about why you think that designation was important for you. Why not just open a private school, for example? And kind of, do you see that microschool legislation as being crucial for kind of activating more of these types of programs?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things is that it creates a space for smaller schools like mine that then don't have to get that certification that a private school does. Because currently the problem with becoming a certified private school is you then end up falling into a lot of the same requirements that the public schools do. So, one thing that one of the reasons I didn't really consider private school for my kids was the fact that at the end of the day, so much of what they do ends up being the same as the public schools because they have to. They have some freedom in what they do, but there's those testing requirements are things that end up forcing their hands and end up forcing them to still follow a lot of the same format that the public schools do. And I think that bill and creating micro schools as its own designation opened it up so that you could have a school where you're going to have a small group of students, mixed stages, working together on learning what they want to learn, when they want to learn it, and with people that are really passionate about helping kids.
And in addition to West Virginia leading the way with their microschool book, legislation, bill, they were also leaders in expanding education choice. They passed the Hope Scholarship Program in West Virginia that is a near universal education savings account. More than 90% of K-12 students in West Virginia have access to about $4,300 per student per year to use as for tuition at microschools or private schools or towards other approved educational expenses. And that really goes a long way for the students attending your microschool, which costs, I think from your website, roughly $6,600 a year, still quite a bit lower than many traditional private school options, but unaffordable for many families, which then again, the Hope Scholarship can come in and help to alleviate some of that additional financial burden and expand accessibility to your program. I wonder what you think about the Hope Scholarship Program and sort of these additional funding mechanisms to expand access.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of the Hope Scholarship. I like the fact that it opens a door not just to students to go to private schools or micro schools, but that it's opened up options for parents that just want to homeschool their kids. To be able to use that money for educational resources or even additional services like tutoring or music lessons. I know I've really encouraged anyone in West Virginia that has a service that could be qualified to go to apply for it. I think the more choices students have, the better. For some parents, homeschooling's the option and they can do that. But there's for some parents that's just not an option. They can't give up that time, especially out here where so many families are struggling. And then some parents want the private schools, and which are often more religious schools, and they want that opportunity. But once again, that doesn't fit everyone. Some parents want something else, something a little more open, and so places like my school that are opening up, and some of the other micro schools I've talked with are opening up options for parents that wouldn't be an option even for us to open if we didn't know that parents had that possibility, that funding to help them.
That's great. And so you're just in the first year of running your microschool. You run it as a year-round mixed stage K-12 program. Tell us a little bit about how many students you have now, what are their kind of roughly their age ranges, and then what do you hope for the kind of future of your program?
So currently I opened up this year. I had some interest, and Hope Scholarship got paused. That really kind of killed things. Of course, it is back and providers like myself are able to receive the funds when we have students signed up. So this year I've had my two kids. So my daughter's in 4th grade and my son who's in kindergarten. But I already for the upcoming school year have a student that'll be in 6th grade that'll be coming in, and a student that'll be a kindergartner just starting out that are coming into the school. And of course, I'm looking to bring more in. My goal would be to go ahead and get up to a full 10 for an educator is my goal, and then even expand past that, because I would really like to have a second educator in the school and expand the school up to closer to 20. But I would love to be able to have a second educator in here, just because there's so many benefits to having someone else and having some extra ideas in here and having someone else to offer some support.
And what about beyond 20? What would, at what point would you feel like the micro piece of microschooling is no longer, characteristic of your program? Is that something that you would be okay with, kind of becoming a larger, private school, no longer a micro school? Or would you want to open additional locations? Have you thought through kind of the future, assuming that the demand for this is quite high, which I imagine it will be?
Yeah, I've played around with the idea. I feel like for the micro school to be a micro school, I can't really see myself getting much larger than 20. I could see maybe going a little past 20 with another educator. I feel like once we once I near that 30 number in my head, it just starts to get a little too big. And maybe that's just having been in the classroom with that many students all at once, and knowing how that can be. But there is at least some options, if I have more teachers in the building to break it up. I've also, I have been pondering whether or not, as this grows and the demand is there, if I would look to expand to other locations. I know I've had people having been at events that are like, oh, if only you were, over here, if only, my kid had this option. I think that is something that I'm going to keep an eye on, mostly because I want to see what ideas other people are coming up with. I'm really hoping that there is a variety of micro schools that open up around the state, in part because I don't want to, I personally don't want to become one of those out of the box micro schools. I wouldn't want to just start branding something and trying to sell that off. I think a big part of what I want to do and what I'm trying to do comes from that place of having that independence and having that control of the school. So if it became something where I did expand out beyond this location, that would definitely be a lot more about finding someone that's has their own passions and supporting those, and just that those passions happen to be similar to what mine were when I started this.
So it's an exciting time in education in West Virginia, not only the microschool bill, but now Hope Scholarship. What is your sense of the future of microschools and education entrepreneurship and these expanded learning options for families? Are you optimistic that there'll be additional choices for families in the coming years?
Yeah, I am. I really think that, at least right now, there seems to be a lot of support for this, and I don't really see that support going away very quickly. I think that the people that have jumped onto this are doing so with the right intentions. And I think that there are pieces already in place that are keeping it from being taken over by the out of the box groups that would just want to very quickly try to load up schools around the state. I think that there's enough of, and some of it could just be West Virginia in itself. There is this sense of, I know the person down the street, so that's the person I trust kind of thing in West Virginia. And I think that will honestly help micro schools stay very much more of a community outgrowth.
So a real culture around homegrown education solutions and community-based microschools with those relationships between founders and families. It's exciting to see what will happen there. Eric, how can my listeners and viewers find out more about your program and connect with you?
If they go to my website, eisenbrains.org, they can find information about the school, and then they can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and the easiest way to get there is probably just find the links on the webpage.
Eric Eisenbrey, thank you again for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you for having me.